Ever wonder, like, why some societies throughout history just became, like, super wealthy and powerful,
Yeah,
while others didn't?
definitely.
Yeah, it's a pretty big question,
It
really.
is. It's something that a lot of people have thought about and tried to answer over the years.
Yeah.
And there's some pretty interesting theories out there.
Absolutely. And that's actually the exact question that a guy named Yali in New Guinea asked. And he was specifically wondering, like, why did Europeans have so much more cargo?
Right, material wealth. Yeah.
Exactly, compared to his own people.
Uh-huh.
So that fundamental question about, like, global inequality and power and prosperity,
Hmm.
that's what we're really going to dive into today.
I'm excited for this one. This is a big one.
It is, and luckily we have an awesome book to kind of guide our deep dive today.
Yeah, this is a classic.
It's Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel.
Yep.
Have you read this one before?
I have. Yeah, it's one of those books that really sticks with you.
Yeah, I agree.
And I think what's really compelling about Diamond's argument is that he kind of pushes back against this idea that, biological differences between people
Right.
are the reason for these disparities in wealth and power.
Right, like some people are just inherently better or something like that.
Yeah, he's saying, no, it's not about that.
Yeah.
It's about the environment
Uh-huh.
and how that has, like, shaped different societies' paths.
Totally. And it's important to remember that, way back, like around 11,000 BCE,
Yeah, way back.
most human societies were pretty similar, actually.
Right, we were all starting from a pretty similar point.
Yeah, they were mostly, hunter-gatherer communities, and their technology wasn't really that different from one another.
Yeah, everyone was working with basically the same tools and techniques.
So the big question here is, what happened?
Right.
What caused some societies to sort of like veer off that initial trajectory and develop so much more in terms of technology and wealth and power than others?
Yeah, and that's what Diamond sets out to explain in this book.
Right. And he starts off, I think, in chapter 1, sort of setting the stage.
Yeah, chapter 1 is all about that starting point.
Exactly. It's called Up to the Starting Line.
Yeah.
And it basically, emphasizes that initial similarity across human societies, over 13,000 years ago.
We were all more or less equal at that point
Yeah.
in terms of our technology and social organization.
And then from there, he goes on to look at how different environments presented, different opportunities, but also limitations.
Right, it's like this branching timeline almost.
Mm-hmm.
Human development influenced by geography.
Yeah.
Different paths depending on where you were in the world.
Absolutely. And one of, I think, the earliest and most significant kind of forks in that timeline was the development of farming.
Right, the transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture.
Exactly. And Diamond uses this example of the Fertile Crescent.
Oh, yeah, that's a key area.
Yeah, which is this area in the Middle East.
Right around where modern-day Iraq and Syria and that region are.
Exactly. And around 11,000 BCE, the people living there, they just happened to be really lucky because they had all these wild versions of plants and animals that were just kind of readily available for domestication.
Right, they were just there for the taking.
Exactly. They had wild wheat and barley, wild goats and sheep.
Yeah, it's like the perfect starter pack for agriculture.
Exactly. So this abundance of, potential crops and livestock really gave them a head start
Huge advantage.
in developing agriculture. And then he compares that to a place like Australia
Right.
at the same time, around 11,000 BCE. And the situation there was just completely different.
Yeah, totally different environment, different resources.
They just didn't have the same kinds of plants and animals that were suitable for domestication. There
Yeah.
were no like wild grasses that could easily be turned into a staple crop like wheat. And the large animals that were there, like kangaroos, they just weren't really suitable for domestication the way that sheep or cattle were.
Right, they weren't built for it.
Exactly. So right from the start, you have these two regions on totally different developmental paths just because of what nature provided.
And this difference is key to Diamond's argument.
Exactly.
It's all about those environmental differences.
Yeah, and in chapter 2, he uses this really fascinating example.
Oh, yeah, love this chapter.
Yeah, to illustrate this point even further. And he talks about the Polynesian Islands, and he calls it like a natural experiment.
Right, because you have all these islands spread across this vast ocean.
Exactly.
And they all have slightly different environments,
They will.
different sizes, different climates, different resources.
So it's like this perfect opportunity to see how those different environments would shape the societies that developed there.
Right. It's like nature's own laboratory.
Exactly. And so he compares, for example, the Maori people who settled New Zealand with the Moriori people who settled the Chatham Islands.
Yeah, which are much smaller and colder.
Exactly.
And much less resource-rich than New Zealand.
So the Maori in New Zealand, they were on these larger, more fertile islands.
Right.
Which allowed them to develop agriculture really successfully.
Yeah, they could grow lots of food.
Exactly. And this, in turn, supported much larger populations and a more complex social structure.
Right, with specialized roles and hierarchies.
Exactly. And then you've got the Moriori, who ended up on these much smaller and colder islands with way fewer resources.
Yeah.
And their environment just couldn't support agriculture on the same scale as in New Zealand.
So they remained hunter-gatherers.
Right.
With much simpler technology.
And this is where it gets really interesting.
Yes, this is where the experiment really plays out.
Because in 1835, the Maori actually arrived in the Chatham Islands.
Right.
And they encountered the Moriori. And because of the Maori's more advanced technology and social organization, they were able to conquer the Moriori pretty easily.
Yeah, it was a pretty one-sided affair.
It's a really stark example of how those different environmental foundations can play out in real-world power dynamics.
And it really highlights Diamond's point.
Totally.
That geography can have a huge impact on the course of history.
So Chapter 3 shifts our focus a little bit.
Yeah.
And brings us to this really pivotal moment in history, the meeting at Cajamarca.
In 1532.
In 1532, where Francisco Pizarro.
Right, the Spanish conquistador.
And his small group of Spanish conquistadors.
Like a ridiculously small group.
Yeah, I think it was only like 168 men or something like that.
Yeah, it's crazy.
They captured the Inca emperor Atahualpa.
Yeah, the ruler of this vast and powerful empire.
Exactly. And Diamond uses this event to really drive home his central argument about why some societies gain dominance over others.
Right. This is a key example for him.
Because it's easy to think that, you know, the Spanish just had some inherent superiority.
Yeah, like they were just better fighters or something.
That's right. But Diamond challenges that idea.
Absolutely.
And he says that their success was really due to these advantages that they had in what he calls guns, germs, and steel.
Yeah, that's his big three.
Exactly. And so let's break that down a little bit.
Okay, let's...
So first of all, guns.
Yeah.
The Spanish had steel weapons and armor, which were way more effective.
Like way more effective.
Than the wooden and stone tools and weapons that the Inca had.
Right. It's not even a fair fight.
And then they also had horses.
Yeah, which the Inca had never seen before.
Exactly. And horses gave them this huge military advantage.
Right, in terms of speed and maneuverability.
Exactly, like the shock of a mounted charge.
Oh, yeah, that would have been terrifying.
I can't even imagine.
Especially for people who had never seen a horse before.
Right.
You know?
But I think maybe the most devastating factor...
Yeah, this is the big one.
...was disease...
Germs.
Germs.
Yeah.
So the Spanish unknowingly carried with them all these European diseases, like smallpox, measles, influenza. And these diseases had already swept through Europe and killed huge numbers of people.
Over centuries.
Centuries ago.
Yeah.
But the Inca had never been exposed to these diseases before.
Right, so they had no immunity.
No immunity whatsoever. And so when these diseases arrived in the Americas, it was just catastrophic.
Absolutely. It ripped through the population.
It killed huge numbers of people, including key leaders.
Right. Even before Pizarro arrived.
Even before Pizarro got there,
Yeah.
the Inca Empire was already weakened significantly by disease.
It's like half the battle was already won.
Exactly. And so this pre-existing weakness was a crucial element in the Spanish conquest.
It really tipped the scales in their favor.
Yeah. And so Diamond argues that, you know, this wasn't just a one-off event.
Right.
This pattern of Eurasian societies, having these advantages in guns, germs, and steel, played out again and again throughout history.
Absolutely. It helps to explain a lot of the patterns of conquest and colonization that we see.
Right. And so in part 2 of the book, Diamond really dives into the specifics of how these advantages arose.
Yeah, and it all starts with farming.
Right.
Chapter 4 is all about farmer power.
Farmer power.
Yeah.
And he basically argues that the development of agriculture was this massive turning point in human history.
Right, it was a game changer.
Because it allowed for the production of surplus food.
Exactly. You could grow more food than you needed to survive.
Right, and that seems like a simple thing.
Yeah.
But it had these huge consequences for everything.
It changed everything.
So first of all,
Yeah.
surplus food allows you to support more people.
Right. More food equals more people.
Exactly.
It's basic math.
Population growth.
Yeah.
And then it also means that people don't have to constantly be on the move.
Right.
Looking for food.
They can settle down.
They can settle down.
Build permanent homes.
Villages.
Yeah.
And then eventually towns and cities.
Mm-hmm.
So we see this shift from this nomadic hunter-gatherer lifestyle to a more settled, sedentary existence.
And this is huge for development.
Yeah, because now you have people living in close proximity.
Right.
They can start to specialize in different tasks.
Yeah, not everyone has to be involved in food production anymore.
Right.
You can have some people who are farmers, some people who are craftspeople.
Soldiers.
Scribes.
Yeah, all sorts of specialized roles.
Exactly. And this specialization is a key driver of both societal complexity and technological innovation.
Because people can focus on developing their skills and coming up with new ideas.
Hunter-gatherer societies.
Yeah.
Who are constantly focused on finding their next meal.
Right, just trying to survive.
Just trying to survive.
Yeah.
They just didn't have the same opportunities for specialization.
No. It's amazing to think that, something as simple as extra food can lead to so many changes.
It's a cascade effect.
Yeah. And to illustrate this point, Diamond contrasts Mesopotamia, where the cultivation of wheat and barley led to these significant food surpluses, and the development of early cities like Uruk.
By around 3000 BCE.
Yeah, so early urbanization with the Australian Aborigines, who relied on wild resources like yams and maintained this more nomadic way of life.
Yeah, with smaller, less densely populated communities.
So you can really see how the ability to farm and create those surpluses creates a different kind of society.
It sets you on a different path.
Absolutely. And then in chapter 5, Diamond asks this really interesting question.
Yeah, history's haves and have-nots.
History's haves and have-nots.
Yeah.
Why didn't farming just pop up everywhere at the same time?
Like, why didn't everyone just start farming?
Exactly. And the answer he gives is basically what he calls geographic luck.
Yeah, not all parts of the world
are
created equal.
Well, and every region on Earth was equally fortunate in terms of having wild plants and animal species that could be easily domesticated.
Some places just hit the jackpot.
Exactly. And he identifies about 5 primary independent centers around the world where domestication arose. And so the Fertile Crescent.
Yeah, we're back to the Fertile Crescent.
Right.
That place was just incredibly lucky.
Like winning the lottery.
Seriously.
They had wild wheat, barley, peas, sheep, goats.
They had it all.
All readily available like 8500 BCE.
Yeah, that's a huge head start.
Huge head start.
In the farming game.
And that gave them a considerable advantage in developing agriculture and everything that comes with it.
All those complex societies and technologies.
And then if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, while farming did eventually become established there, the region just lacked a lot of native species that were easily domesticated.
Right.
And Diamond uses the example of the zebra, which despite its potential as a draft animal.
It seems like it would be useful.
Right.
But it's just not.
It's just not domesticable.
Too aggressive, too hard to train.
Right.
Just wouldn't work.
So this lack of readily domesticable native species meant that farming arrived much later in sub-Saharan Africa.
Right.
And often through contact with other regions.
Yeah, it wasn't an independent invention there.
Right. And in chapter 6, To Farm or Not to Farm.
Catchy title.
It is.
Yeah.
Diamond reminds us that adopting agriculture wasn't always this simple, obvious choice.
Right. It wasn't always a no-brainer.
For every society.
It really depended on the local condition.
Right, exactly.
Sometimes sticking with hunting and gathering was a perfectly viable strategy.
Yeah.
Even a better strategy.
Maybe even a better strategy.
Yeah, depending on where you were.
And so the decision to switch to farming involved weighing the benefits against the existing availability and reliability of wild food sources.
If you've got a good thing going, why mess with it?
Exactly. And he gives the example of the Native American tribes in California.
Oh, yeah.
So they were relatively close to areas where maize farming had been adopted.
Right.
But a lot of Californian groups stuck with their traditional practice of gathering acorns.
Acorns were a great food source for them.
Right.
Plentiful, and reliable.
Yeah, and so there wasn't a huge incentive to switch to this more labor-intensive process of agriculture.
Right. Why bother?
Exactly. But on the other hand, you've got groups in the American Southwest, like the Pueblo people, and they adopted maize farming from Mexico.
By around 1000 BCE.
Around 1000 BCE, because in their environment, maize was a really productive and sustainable way to get food.
So it made sense for them to switch.
Right. And so Chapter 7, How to Make an Almond.
Another great title.
Love the titles in this book.
Yeah, Diamond's got a knack for it.
He does. And so this chapter gets into this process of plant domestication itself.
Right.
And it wasn't just like, okay, find a wild plant and decide to grow it.
It's way more complicated than that.
Right.
A lot of wild plants have traits that aren't ideal for us to eat.
Right. They might be toxic.
Yeah.
Or the edible parts might be tiny.
Or they might have really tough seeds.
Right.
Or they might shatter when you try to harvest them.
All kinds of things that make them not so great for agriculture.
And domestication is basically the process of overcoming those challenges.
Right.
Through selective breeding.
Yeah. So you take generations.
Yeah, many generations.
Of carefully selecting and breeding plants.
Right.
To enhance the traits we want, like bigger seeds or less toxicity, and get rid of the ones we don't want.
It's a slow and painstaking process.
It is. And he uses this really interesting example.
Oh, yeah, the almond.
Yeah. So wild almonds, they actually contain cyanide.
Poisonous.
Yeah. So they're bitter and poisonous.
Not something that you want to be snacking on.
Not a good snack. But luckily for almond lovers everywhere, there were these rare non-toxic mutations.
Just by chance.
Right.
These mutations popped up.
And people in the Mediterranean region.
Yeah, around 3000 BCE.
They recognized these mutants and they started cultivating them.
And that's how we got the sweet edible almonds we know and love today.
It's crazy to think about how much human intervention has shaped even something as familiar as an almond.
It's a testament to human ingenuity.
It really is.
Yeah.
And then Chapter 8.
Apples or Indians?
Apples or Indians.
Another catchy title.
Shifts our focus to how crops and farming practices spread across different regions.
Yeah, why did agriculture spread faster in some places than others?
Right, and he looks at why some areas saw agriculture spread really quickly, while in other areas it was a much slower process.
And the answer, again, lies in geography.
Exactly.
So the east-west orientation of Eurasia played a really significant role here. Regions located along similar lines of latitude tend to have similar climates and growing seasons.
Yeah.
So it was relatively easy for domesticated plants, like wheat, to spread eastward from their origins in Turkey all the way to India by around 5000 BCE.
Right, because they were moving through similar environmental zones.
Yeah, it's like they had a clear path.
Exactly.
No major obstacles in their way.
And then contrast that with the Americas, which are oriented mostly north to south. And when you move north or south in the Americas, you encounter very different climates and ecological zones.
Right, much more quickly.
So this created major barriers to the spread of crops.
Yeah, it was much harder for plants to adapt to those different conditions.
Exactly. And Diamond gives the example of maize.
Right. Corn.
Which was first domesticated in Mexico. But it had a much harder time spreading to the Andes Mountains.
Yeah, because it had to go through all these different climate zones.
Exactly, like tropical lowlands and then high mountains.
Yeah, it's a tough journey.
It's a tough journey for a plant.
For sure.
And so Chapter 9 introduces a key parallel to plant domestication.
Yeah.
And that's the domestication of animals.
Right.
And the chapter title is amazing.
Yeah. Zebras' Unhappy Marriages and the Anna Karenina Principle.
What a title.
I love it.
And it's basically saying that for animal domestication, just about everything needs to go right.
It's much harder than domesticating plants.
Right.
It's not just about taming an animal.
Right.
A species needs a very specific set of characteristics to be successfully domesticated.
So what are those characteristics?
So first of all, they need to be reasonably docile.
Okay. Calm and easy to handle.
Right. Not too aggressive.
Uh-huh.
They usually need to live in herds.
Okay, so they're used to being around other animals.
Exactly. They have that social structure already.
Oh, okay.
They have to be willing to breed in captivity.
Right.
Some animals just won't do that.
They get stressed out.
Yeah.
Right.
And they need to have a diet that's not too specialized.
Right.
Or too difficult for humans to provide.
Like they can't be picky eaters.
Exactly. Got to be able to eat what we give them.
Right. And unfortunately, for a lot of parts of the world,
Right.
Most large mammal species just didn't have these necessary traits.
Yeah, it's really tough to meet all those criteria.
And Diamond uses the example of the zebra again.
Yeah. Back to the zebra.
Poor zebra.
It seems like it would be so useful.
Right.
But it's just not domesticable.
Nope.
Too aggressive.
Yeah.
Too hard to train.
Just wouldn't work.
Nope.
And so out of all the large mammals on Earth,
yeah,
only like 14 species.
14, that's it.
That's it.
Out of all of them.
Have ever been successfully domesticated.
Crazy, isn't it?
It's crazy to think about how limited our options were.
Like, we really lucked out with those 14.
Yeah, and the consequences of this limitation were huge.
Absolutely.
Eurasian societies were fortunate enough to have domesticable horses.
Right.
And so they were able to develop cavalry.
By around 2000 BC.
Around 2000 BCE, which gave them this massive military advantage.
Right.
But African societies, lacking domesticable equids like zebras, didn't have this technology available to them.
So they were at a disadvantage.
And then in Chapter 10,
Spacious Skies and Tilted Axes.
He kind of circles back to the importance of continental axes.
Yeah, this is a recurring theme in the book. It's really important to Diamond's argument.
In the spread of agriculture and technology. So he's saying that the east-west axis of Eurasia acted as this kind of superhighway, facilitating the spread of both domesticated crops and new ideas across similar latitudes and climates.
It's easy to move things east and west.
Yeah.
When the climate is relatively consistent.
And then again, you contrast that with the north-south axis of the Americas and Africa.
Which are much more difficult for spreading things.
Even over relatively short distances, moving north or south often means encountering these drastically different climates.
And vegetation.
Right.
Making it much harder for crops and technologies to spread from one region to another.
And he gives this example of the llama, domesticated in the Andes around 3000 BCE. But despite the fact that the distance between the Andes and Mexico isn't that much greater than the east-west spread of wheat in Eurasia. Llamas never made it to Mexico because those tropical lowlands acted as this major barrier.
Right, just couldn't get through.
And so now we move into part 3 of the book.
Okay.
And chapter 11.
Lethal Gift of Livestock.
Lethal Gift of Livestock.
Yeah.
And this is a really interesting chapter.
Yeah, this one's a bit darker.
Yeah, it's about disease.
It is.
And so Diamond explains that the close proximity between humans and domesticated animals in Eurasia led to this phenomenon called zoonotic transfer.
Yeah.
Which is basically diseases jumping from animals to humans.
Like a crossover episode.
Yeah.
But not a fun one.
Not a fun one at all.
No.
And so over long periods, Eurasian populations developed varying degrees of immunity or resistance to these diseases.
The smallpox.
Smallpox, measles, influenza.
And it was a really slow and often deadly process.
Yeah, a lot of people died.
But it did lead to a certain level of protection.
Right.
For those populations that had lived alongside these animals for millennia.
They had built up some defenses.
Right, but here's the thing. These diseases, to which Eurasians had developed some resistance, became incredibly destructive biological weapons.
Yeah, not good. When they were introduced to populations that had never been exposed to them before.
Like the Native Americans.
Like the Native Americans.
After 1492.
After 1492.
Yeah.
And so the death rates from these diseases,
like smallpox, in the Americas were just devastating.
Devastating.
Wiping out up to 90% of the population in some areas.
It's hard to even comprehend.
Yeah, it's hard to wrap your head around.
The scale of that tragedy.
And it had a profound impact on the course of history.
Absolutely. And so chapter 12.
Blueprints and borrowed letters.
Blueprints and borrowed letters.
Yeah.
Looks at the development and spread of writing systems.
Another key factor.
Which is another key factor.
The rise of complex societies.
Right.
Supported by those food surpluses we were talking about earlier.
Right, because you need some way to manage and organize all those resources.
Right, and all those people.
And Diamond outlines 2 main ways that writing systems have spread.
So the first way is what he calls blueprint copying.
Blueprint copying. Yeah.
So an entire writing system is adopted, and then adapted by another culture.
Like taking the whole thing and tweaking it a bit.
And so the relationship between Sumerian cuneiform, which dates back to like 3000 BCE.
Right, one of the earliest writing systems.
And Egyptian hieroglyphs is a good example of this.